Greetings all. So today we're going to talk about revolution and the revolutionary era and a little bit on how the Enlightenment era kind of weaved into this or impacted this and sort of was the prelude to this. So kind of jumping in a little bit here, let me get us over here first and foremost. Talking about new vocabulary. Um, So, new vocabulary for the Revolutionary Era. Some of these terms we saw a little bit of before. So, this list represents some new words or reuse of old words, but some new words that described the social world post 1765. So, we're going to kind of cover a wide swath of time because we're talking about revolution in multiple different ways here. So, during which the world became increasingly urbanized. So, moved from an agrarian style lifestyle, so moving away from as much farming and whatnot, to becoming more urbanized, more into a city lifestyle. So, workers moved into the cities, into factories, etc. Conditions of filth, disease, and hunger often led to violent protests and that kind of thing, which became problematic as we will talk about as we move forward. Orators denounced tyranny and demanded new rights and freedoms. So this heavily changed the whole face of social structure. So a lot of that came from everything that we had been talking about before, right? Think for yourself, remove the change of tutelage, and the whole thing about the problems of being under the thumb of certain types of religious institutions that didn't want people to question anything, and certain types of tyrannies that didn't want people to think for themselves or question anything. And Enlightenment really pushed the envelope for think for yourself, ask the questions, because if there's nothing wrong with these types of institutions, then they will answer the questions, right? There's nothing wrong with asking the questions. So as this got pushed and pushed and pushed, you can imagine that more and more questions were there and people wanted the answers. So they demanded new rights and new freedoms. Like, why don't we have these rights? Why don't we have these freedoms? So as we will see, that will, well, it will cause revolution. That's what it will cause. The idea of the ordinary man is up here in quotation marks, largely inspired by Napoleon, which we'll get to in just a minute, because he was an ordinary soldier that rose to conquer most of Europe. So that showed that you can rise above your station that you were born into, which was basically unheard of before that. So it's kind of in the guise of the underdog, right? He was inspired to reach beyond his allotted station in life, which was a big thing. Journalism and liberal and conservative, these words become new in this time period. So showing two separate ideas, especially in the American colonies as they go forward. And the idea of capitalism and the middle class, which we kind of started talking about a little bit, as the free market became more robust and a different class of people had money that they had never had before and pulled away from a lower class into a middle class that was not didn't exist before, right? Because we talked about that's why all the idea of decorum came up, because of all that social upheaval that was part of that. So this is kind of where we're going with some of this, moving into this idea. All right, so let's kind of bring on the whole revolutions here. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Industrial Revolution, right? So the Industrial Revolution began in England, and other nations emulated England in England's innovations as commercial and military power imperialized vast portions of the entire world. So you may or may not have heard the saying, "The sun never sets" on the British Empire, because at some point in its heyday, that was a truism, right? Because England, though it's a small space by itself as its own little country, because they had colonies spread all over the world, right? Because America started out as a British colony. They had colonies everywhere. And so, in thinking of that all the colonies were just an extension of England itself, well, the sun never set on the British Empire, right? Because no matter where the sun was going down, it couldn't ever set fully on the British Empire because there was always another place where the sun was up in the British Empire, right? So it was huge. It was just huge, and it continued to amass power at that time. And because of that, because of so much stretching and moving out into all of these different countries, pulling all of these different textiles and resources from these different countries, they were able to be very innovative in their technology for the time and their inventions. So absolutely, industrial revolution started there and then spread throughout the other countries. So their commercial and military power was vast. Landowners lost legal control over serfs in Russia, and farmers in Europe developed new entrepreneurial roles for themselves. So they weren't under the thumb in the same way that they were before in the farming industry. The farming industry changed anyways, greatly, and there wasn't that whole serfdom type of setup that they had before. So now they could run the farms in a different way than they had previously. And they became their own businessmen, right? Entrepreneurial. And they had different roles for themselves as the peasantry working for them then acquired more autonomy, or they moved into factory, some of the people that worked for them moved into factory labor in the textile industry. So the farming industry was greatly altered at this point because of textiles, because of the factories and the urbanization that was taking place across all the countries, especially places like England. Factory and labor, okay, so I just said that, which was often worse for health and pockets of the people. So the picture here, if you could see it depending on what you're watching this on, is of multiple people and families like out on a street, including little children and stuff, and they're like up against the side of a building, and they're like holding on to some belongings, and they're basically living in filth. Because that's what often happened during this time period. The promise of the big city, the promise of big dreams, the promise of a lot of money, and jobs and stuff like that in the cities. So people flocked to the cities absolutely in droves and droves and droves. And only to get there and find that, yeah, there had been a lot of jobs in the factories, but of course the first several waves of people took those jobs, and then what happened afterwards is then they had people living on the streets, people living in little tiny shanty lean-tos, or people living whole entire families or multiple families to teeny tiny rooms or out on streets and lean-tos, and they were just packed onto the streets. Not a lot of plumbing systems or gutter systems, because the town just did not imagine that that's what was going to happen and could not grow to accommodate that many people in such a very, very short amount of time. And you can imagine that with that many people in that short of time and that level of filth that everybody would be living in, right, with no way to bathe and no way to get rid of their own waste, and of course at that time period no plumbing and that kind of thing. What was going to happen? Well, what did happen eventually, which was plague. So, a lot of sickness, and the pay sucked because of course the jobs weren't there after the first wave of people came in, or two. And then factories would go up like overnight, not literally, but quickly. And then the working conditions became worse. So the more people that were there available to work, the more people they could work. And the worse the working conditions would be, and the less they would pay them because they could. There was 5 more people lined up outside to take your seat at the sewing machine if you weren't willing to sit there for 12, 15, 16 hours at a time, including children. And then they would lock people in, right? You've probably heard those stories of being locked in. Talk about not getting to take your break every 4 hours. Try no break for 14 hours. They tied people to chairs sometimes, or there were stories of being locked in, fires that happened, right? Freezing to death inside of some of the places, or being sweltering hot in them, and people just dropping dead at a spot, being carted off, and the next person sitting down at their seat. So not a pretty picture at the time, but part of like the growing pains of any kind of industrial revolution, because that's just what happened. Because cotton and textile became the cotton became the biggest textile in the textile industry at the time, of the market development. So colonialism allowed for market development, both in gathering new resources from the territories, which is what I was saying just a second ago, that were conquered, and in procuring goods from the lands that to sell in Europe, right? Because of course, if you go into new lands that you've never been into before, you discover things that they have in those countries that you don't have in yours. So you bring them back to your country and sell them for a markup price, which of course we still do. And like I said, cotton was the primary product harvested by slaves at the time and shipped to textile factories in England. So it started creating its own problem as so many people came into the cities. There wasn't enough people out on the farms, and then a lot of the farms failed because so many people went to the cities, and because the farms failed, it forced more people to go into the cities, but there was already too many people in the cities, and it created its own vicious cycle here. So it became a unfortunate turn of events for a while things evened themselves out. All right, so that was just like the tiniest speck of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because of course that was all the negatives, and of course the positives of the Industrial Revolution was all of the inventions and forward motion that we got and the traction we got from there. We wouldn't be holding smartphones in our hands today. I wouldn't be making this video today. We wouldn't be driving the vehicles we have today if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution. So sorry that they painted such a bleak picture of that, but the revolution is messy. If you remember back when we were talking about how not Immanuel Kant, we were talking about Voltaire. Voltaire, even though he was for, he was pro-enlightenment, obviously, and thinking for yourself, he did have some issues with some of it, and which one of them was democracy, right? His thing about democracy was pure democracy. He didn't like pure democracy because he didn't like the masses making decisions of politics for everybody else, because he felt that the masses were uneducated and shouldn't be making such important decisions. So obviously that meant he wasn't for pure democracy. Also, he felt that remaining, if you remember back to us talking about Voltaire, he felt that in being underneath a enlightened an enlightened king or queen was better than revolution, that you should make it through that kind of a situation than going through revolution. And part of that, where of course he got a lot of criticism for that naturally, because it made him sound like going against what he was preaching about thinking for yourself, but part of it was because he felt there were so many drawbacks to revolution, as we were just looking at, right? Some of the drawbacks of revolution is the messiness, right? And as we'll see when we talk about the French Revolution in a minute, there's a lot of messy before you get to the good, right? And perhaps a generation, maybe even two sometimes, before sometimes that good comes from that revolution. Usually not in the lifetime or immediately after of the people producing the revolution. So, political revolution, talking about democracy, which would be new in this era, right? So, the revolutionaries in France and America, which I may have these flipped backwards, but argued that ordinary people should take political decision making into their own hands. A lot of that because of so much corruption and problems in politics, and of course, because before America separated off, we were talking about how imperialism worked, and of course, kings and inheritance of titles and stuff like that, versus people choosing who would lead them. And that then we come back to this questioning of the Enlightenment period, right? Where if you go back to the change in religious views for a lot of people and the change of thinking about where was God in all this, and God is the watchmaker, or learning about spirituality and God and Christianity through nature and what is in front of them, made them rethink how did you get to choose to be king? And of course, royalty and nobility's original way of keeping power was saying that they were chosen by God, right? Royal blood was divine blood, right? That's how that worked originally. So as more and more Enlightenment thinking went forward, they questioned that and were like, that doesn't make sense. If we're going to go forward thinking that that's not how fate works and that's not how God works, then you can't have been chosen by God to lead me as king or queen. So once they began to go down that track, they began to talk about democracy. They began to talk about we want to choose who leads us, and not because you're saying you get to lead us, that God chose you, because we don't buy that. All right. So more questions came in here. North America, the colonial subjects were resentful of the English king, which you will see why reading the Declaration of Independence, why they were resentful. Whose politics and economic policies led, sorry, I'm losing my voice, guys, led the American colonies to declare independence in 1776, of course, not only from English rule, but also from the practice of hereditary monarchy, and instead to favor an elected president with power vested in the people, hence democracy. So, derived from the consent of the governed, democracy. This is a picture of Rousseau. Rousseau said, "Man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains." That's not necessarily back to a comment of specifically just democracy, but it is part of that whole idea of participation in government, participation in ruling, participation in saying, participation in speaking, right? Of what they right to speak, right? Freedom of speech, right? Everywhere in chains. Born free, but everywhere in chains. The idea of democracy, that the general will of the people shaped politics more than an individual's will, evolved from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writing. So his writing is what sort of pushed that out there, and this original, not original, because obviously you can trace back to, Greeks and whatnot, but evolved from some of this thinking about not just one person's will like a king, but thinking of the will of the people who are going to be ruled, to think of what would be best for them, or at least what they want and how they would like to be ruled. Okay, thinking on and looking at the French Revolution, bloody, violent. The French also rejected an absolutist monarchy. I mean, it wasn't like one day they all woke up and decided to do this. It was long coming. The peasants rejected the excessive tithes and taxes that they paid during periods when the harvests were low and the bread costs were double. So again, it took a long time coming. They went through a long period of essentially starvation for many of them, where they couldn't afford their own bread, right? So, say you were a peasant and you made bread or you made wheat or harvested wheat, and you wouldn't be able to afford the very product that you yourself made because of how much taxes you paid or how much tithes you owed to the monarchy. And at some point, they were done. And especially because at the time, the particular monarchy that was in place, they felt that they were flaunting their riches and their spending. At least that was the perception of the people at the time. So, which I believe was Marie Antoinette. And the people were broken and had had enough. So on July 14th, 1789, the peasants stormed the Bastille, which is what this is a painting of, this famous painting of them storming the Bastille, a symbol of royal power, and demanded liberation. And like I said, it was bloody. They did execute the king and the queen eventually, so that did not do well for them either. The French National Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which you'll also read, which asserted equality and freedom of all men and abolished the notion of aristocratic or hereditary privilege, which was huge. That's a huge change, right? Abolished the notion of aristocratic or hereditary privilege, separated church and state. So that's separating of church and state back in 1789 for the French. Abolished slavery in the colonies for the French. This was the French, 1789. And granting equal rights to everyone, including for the first time the Jews. And this is 1789. And again, this is French, right? So this was a huge thing for them. So they managed this huge coup, the French Revolution. So we talked about three big chunks. Now, these weren't the only three types of revolution happening at the time. There were many others, but it's not history class, so we're not going to go into massive details about all of them. But just these are the big giant bullet points on the board for these that really affected the more. But as you can imagine, what happens, and this is where Voltaire was worried about revolution, it's not a simple thing. It's not a simple thing. Sometimes it works out well, where in the aftermath of revolution, there is peace and prosperity. In the Americas, it went pretty well for a while, but not so much for everybody. So let's talk about the Reign of Terror. Sometimes what happens is people maybe didn't think about next steps, right? Okay, we got here, we stormed the Bastille, we were able to write this up, and we got rid of the king and the queen, and we didn't think about putting in our own power play at the time. So what often happens in a power vacuum? As we will see later when we get to World War II, in the absence of in a power vacuum, another power will step in, and often not one that you want. So, weakened by civil revolt and the wars, neighboring European countries who feared that the French revolutionary sentiments were contagious, French rule was seized by the radical Jacobins. So that's what the Reign of Terror is about. So in this power vacuum come the Jacobins, who established a centralized dictatorship. Yeah, that's not better. And mass executed groups of people suspected of treason. So this is one of the Jacobins. This is portraying the massive amount of people that would just get carted away for any kind of reason that they felt that they were looking at them sideways, disrespecting their authority, and they would stick them in these carts, crate them away, and kill them, execute them for treason, right? And of course, treason is any word. The treason just means you went against whoever was in power at the time. The period was known as the Reign of Terror for the ruthlessness and extremism of this new government. It eventually ceased and was replaced in 1790 with a new dictator, which was Napoleon. So then there was that, right? So one swoop after another, Napoleon jumps in and is like, this is unsatisfactory, but creates his own dictatorship. But if your dictatorship looks less extreme than another dictatorship, then it's welcomed, ish. So in 1799, so we're talking about Napoleon now, we have Napoleon, established a new dictatorship in France, so we're still in France, reinstated slavery, there you go, and crowned himself emperor in 1804. So that whole idea, obviously, of moving away from those types of titles, he's like, I'm not just the king, I am the emperor, right? I am the emperor. Prior to this event, the Pope was the one who crowned kings and emperors. The Pope in this painting is behind him because he wanted to crown himself. He wanted to keep that the church did not have power over him, that he had power above the church. Hence the Pope behind him, witnessing him crown himself, showing that divine right and hereditary monarchy under God's will were irrelevant, that he made this decision. After numerous failed attempts at world conquest, although he got really close, Napoleon was defeated by the British at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. So he had a 16 year run. He went really far for starting off as just a foot soldier. He becomes famous for that. He famously established the Napoleonic Code, right? A new legal system modeled after that of ancient Rome. So he reached back, hence he obviously had a fascination with being emperor. The new legal system abolished all the hereditary principles. Obviously, since he was the underdog and he had just come up from no kind of noble anything, he didn't want anything to do with hereditary principles. He promoted employment based on skill rather than social connection and status. He felt your skill should be what got you the job and what let you shine in any type of sphere. He established freedom of religion. So I guess he did a couple good things along the way. Napoleon directly influenced South American countries to gain independence from Spanish rule. So he did a lot in a short period of time. Okay, so that was a lot to happen in the aftermath of revolution, right? So started off with Enlightenment, sparked all of these new ideas, these new pieces, these new inventions, all this new technology, this new thinking, questioning, changes are made, revolutions are had, and then a few power vacuums in a few places create some problems. We get some dictatorship, we have a lot more war in some areas, and create some issues, obviously. And then we move on to what some of that spurns, which is some of the artistic visionaries and writers, and even more some of the ideas of where they come from themselves. So first we're going to talk about the proletariat. So it's a fancy word, people don't use it as much anymore. Proletariat, so workers who had been exploited, mobilized, right? Because as you can imagine, that whole thing we were talking about in the first slide with the factory conditions and cramming everybody into it, nobody's getting a break, working people 7 days a week, and just being 100% taken advantage of and then some, that didn't get fixed for a very, very long time. So as long as people needed to eat, people needed money, as long as people needed money to eat, then people were going to be taken advantage of in jobs because people were scared. People were scared to complain about conditions because they knew there were 5, 10, 15 people behind them ready to jump into their chair and take their job, so they wouldn't dare complain. Well, what kind of a position does that put you in when that's true? It puts you in the perfect position to be absolutely brutalized by the people running your factory. That's what. So they could take full advantage of you. And working conditions, who cares about working conditions? I don't need to spend any money on my factory and make you comfortable in it or worry about giving you a break to, like, I don't know, eat a sandwich. Who cares about that? Water, I don't need to make sure you have running water. I just need you to sit there and work until I say you can go home, right? That's how that was going. And it didn't get better. In fact, it got worse first. So workers who had been exploiting finally were like, this is wrong. And they mobilized, right? Organizing strikes, protests against economic and political inequities, right? And inequalities. They called themselves initially the proletariat or working class. And this is happening for the first time, and we're like in the mid 1800s about this time, right? Early to mid 1800s. So the proletariat or working class, in 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, these guys over here, published the Communist Manifesto, which ends with "Workers of the world unite," right? I think that's maybe what this says at the bottom. I can't read it. Workers of the world unite, right? Communist Manifesto. And not like communist China, okay, and communist Russia. That's a perversion of communism, right? That's them taking a word that was meant to be something good if you were going to talk about communal living, and turning it into something very, very bad and abused by leadership that could then take advantage of people anyways. So it ends with "Workers of the world unite," and it's about pulling together. These words inspired change internationally. This is Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels with Marx's family. And this right image is a mural by Diego Rivera in Mexico City, showing the history of Mexico, focused on Karl Marx here. So that's a huge change. That's again people getting sick of being mistreated and standing up for themselves. So maybe not a revolution to the degree of Industrial Revolution and French Revolution, but still like a revolution, right? A workers' revolution. Not standing for it anymore, not going to let people abuse them in the same way anymore. And hence we end up with labor forces, etc., to protect their rights as workers. In wow, now I'm really squeaky. 1848, oh wow, Springtime of the Peoples, that's what it was called. This year marked a period of international revolutions in France, Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Spain, Germany, Italy, Denmark, and Romania. That's a lot. That's a lot of revolution. The French abolished slavery again, but permanently this time in 1848. Okay, permanently this time. Never to be seen again in France. Gone. Women's rights activists in the United States organized their first convention ever in Seneca Falls. That's new. So this became known as the Springtime of the Peoples because people around the world were like, we're done with this. We need to have better rights, and refused to be smothered by it. Lots of revolution. Okay. Revolutionary writers. So let's bring it back to reel us back in where we are here in our lit class, because you probably thought you somehow wandered off into Mr. Mariocourt's history class and suddenly he sounded like Miss Weiss. So revolutionary writers, Now, when we move on to, which we'll move on to next, the Romantics, which we'll spend a little time with, there are going to be names on this list that will end up on that list also. And it's because there becomes a natural progression of the revolutionary writers into the romantic writers. And we'll talk about why when we talk about the Romantics, but some of them were very young in this revolutionary writer era. And again, the revolutionary era spans a huge piece of time. And when we talk about the Romantics, it's kind of tucked in there and rides alongside it. I will show you guys a timeline next time, so you kind of have a better idea of how these time periods and eras sit together, which is why some of these names will overlap. So some of it isn't so much, or not just who they are, but what their purpose was at the time that they were writing. So you got to think about what are they doing here, right? So we'll talk about for just a minute. Let me see if I had kind of a basic idea of what I was thinking. I'll give you a couple of examples. Like much of William Blake, great revolutionary writer, much of his poetry exposes like church and government corruption, okay, and demands fair labor rights for women and children. So that's an example of how he fits into revolutionary writers. Heinrich Heine, he supported a workers' uprising stemming from economic and political inequality. So again, you could see why that's a revolutionary writer. It's the subject matter here. So some of their poetry, some of their early on poetry especially, was political, right? Revolutionary, supportive, political based. Elizabeth Barrett Browning used some of her poetry to persuade contemporaries to limit child labor in factories, because that was a big problem during that time period. A lot of child labor. And unfortunately, some of it was just to help feed the families when it was really bad. Andres Bello, named the artistic liberator, inspired Latin Americans to use their own themes and ideas in writing. So he wanted them to use their own voice to speak out against things in the revolutionary era. Jose Marti, established himself as a national poet, revolutionary fighter, political prisoner. So that made him stand out. I mean, he went through a lot during the revolutionary era, and then it reflected heavily in his poetry. So that voice bounced back at people from his own experiences. So he's under revolutionary writers. Burke reflected on the vagaries of the French Revolution and those problems that happened in France. Wordsworth and Coleridge, we will see their names definitely across both genres, this and in the Romantics, collaborated on ballads and other things that reflected language of the common man. So that will become a big theme both in the revolutionary writing and also on the other side. So the common man theme, talking about what's happening with the everyday person. Charles Dickens, like Tale of Two Cities, exposed poverty in England and France, things that people didn't talk about before. But there it was, kind of stripped down and naked for people to see in their poetry, when before you didn't write like that. You didn't expose things like that. You didn't talk about that ugly side of things. Oh my gosh, we don't say that stuff, right? And there it was in their poetry. And Hugo, whose work in French poetry, novels, theater, does have a lot of romanticism in it, but also blended into the revolutionary writers as well. Percy Shelley saw modernism inside of the revolution, but he also saw a downside to it. So he had both sides to it, where he saw the positive and the negative. Tolstoy and Melville, which I don't have on here, have not were more like novelists. We will read Tolstoy later. So artists increasingly created art for the people. Oh, I actually have that. Hang on a second. I wrote that down. Haha. So revolutionary writer themes, because usually there's some kind of a assignment that goes with this. What are you looking for when you're trying to peel out? Is this more of a revolutionary writer theme versus a romantic writing theme? Because with some of them writing across both pieces, what does this more look like? So, what are revolutionary writer themes? Church and government corruption? Are they touching upon church and government corruption? If so, you're looking at revolutionary writer themes. Demands for fair labor rights, especially if they're looking at women and children during that time period, then you're looking at revolutionary writer themes. Support for workers' uprising, and again for economic and political inequality, you're looking at revolutionary writers' themes. And just kind of a change in how art works. Remember in our previous period when we were talking about Enlightenment art, they would have art there in thinking about art for reasons that were to teach, but to do it in a very artistic style that they knew was not realistic, and that was fine because underneath it was still all there. Everything to say what they wanted to say, to teach what they wanted to teach, for whatever lesson they were trying to get across, it could still be there. And it didn't need to be realistic. They purposely did not try to represent the real world. That was a purposeful attempt in Enlightenment artistry. But there was still sometimes some patronage systems in Enlightenment, especially early Enlightenment. And a patronage system means you have to create your art by somebody else paying for your life, essentially. Unfortunately, that would also mean that you're under somebody's thumb telling you, yes, I like this, no, I don't like this, regardless if you, as the artist, liked it or not. Which means your art was then being kind of molded, for lack of a less artistic term, by your patron, right? And not just by you as the artist. So that's gone now. As we move into the revolutionary era, art is for art's sake, which sometimes is really good, and sometimes you're just like, sometimes it's not. It'll get really weird. We're going to go through some weird periods of art where you're like, what is that? But it doesn't have to be didactic purpose. So that means, it doesn't have to be for teaching purposes. It doesn't have to be. A lot of them still are. These are all for teaching purposes, right? Supporting, going against government corruption, demands for fair labor, support for workers' uprising. That's most certainly a lesson. These are lessons, teaching something. So it's not just for art's sake, but there was this whole idea of, as we move forward through into this period, the 1800s towards the 1900s, we will see more of this art for art's sake, just for the beauty of it, just for the feel of it, just for the emotion of it, and less obvious, clear tracks of what does it mean, okay? And no more patronage, no more under the patronage. So it's coming straight from the artist. There's not this extra layer of filtering in between, which was the patron. That's removed. So that was good. So that's a change, right, in art in all ways, whether it's painting, sculpting, writing, anything. That's a change. So when you're reading some of the stuff this time, things to think about for revolutionary writer themes.